Nonna Mayer, thanks for being with us. Why are we seeing today in France and in Germany an upsurge in violent acts against the Jewish minority?
Firstly, it's not just since yesterday. In fact, the rise in anti-Semitic violence across Europe started in 2000 with the Second Intifada. Just before that, anti-Semitic acts were at a residual level. So there was an impact from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with peaks of more than 1,000 acts and threats recorded in France after Operation Protective Edge and Operation Cast Lead. But effectively, in 2017, we saw a growth in violence. It was in a context of tensions of identity, of a surge by the radical populist right, the extreme right, and above all, social networks become more and more significant and inflamed the debate. All that led to a spike in violence, which didn't just involve anti-Semitic acts, it targeted homosexuals, Roma, but also Muslim women wearing headscarves. It was a context which incited violence.
There is also talk of a correlation in Germany between the arrival of refugees coming from countries at war with Israel and the rise in anti-Semitic acts. Is that something you've observed in your research?
There have been a few isolated acts, but there's no upsurge. We've carried out a survey in 5 European countries. Effectively, in Jewish communities, there's a fear of potential anti-Semitism among refugees coming from countries hostile to Israel. But if you take the case of Germany, you see a 92% spike in violent acts in 2017, linked to people from the far right. So it's a bit complex. Let's say there's fear, but for the moment, nothing is proven.
And what's happening in the rest of Western Europe, for example, in the UK, Belgium, to mention some neighbouring countries?
We see a rise in anti-Semitic acts of aggression all over since 2000, the year of the Second Intifada, with peaks of violence corresponding to Israeli operations in the occupied territories.
So here again, we're seeing the Intifada being played out on European soil.
Yes. There's also jihadist terrorism with Al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State. But there's also something we don't speak of, which is ordinary, everyday anti-Semitism. The spitting, the daily insults, which aren't necessarily reported to the police, but which are the most painful and which rot the lives of Jewish people.
Let's talk briefly about Eastern Europe, where anti-Semitism plays out differently and has different historic causes.
Because in a way, communism froze in time these attitudes at the level they had been in the 1930s. So there was no act of conscience, this reflection on history that took place in Western democracies. There is, moreover, a rise of far-right populism in these countries, and the Jew is seen as the ideal scapegoat. I think of George Soros in Hungary, or the rewriting or revision of history in Poland.
Are Jews in Europe today the most threatened minority?
If we look at the small number of Jews in Europe, and France has the largest Jewish community with 500,000 people, it's still just 0.6% of the entire population. In proportion to their number, it's the minority which files the most complaints to the police, and not everything is reported.
Is it the most stigmatized minority in Europe?
No. By far the most stigmatized minority in Europe is the Roma.
Nonna Mayer, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.